You might think that painting backgrounds is easy. Green for grass, blue for sky, but the truth is much more complicated.
In this video, we're going to teach you the basics of light, value, color, and atmosphere, along with some practical tips for painting backgrounds for TV animation in Photoshop.
Brent, isn't there like some kind of robot or AI plugin that can paint these backgrounds for us?
Well, I don't think the internet has just batch uploaded a bunch of hand-drawn, cartoony Gravity Falls style backgrounds, so we haven't lost our jobs. Yet.
BAM is the show where professional animation artists redraw the art that you send in. And if you like supporting that sort of thing, check out our Patreon linked below.
So, what is the difference between painting for art and painting for animation?
Although they can share similar techniques, I would argue that the goal of any background painting is to actually manipulate and stylize representational art into such a way that it helps tell a story.
Because animation and all its parts are for telling stories.
Backgrounds can transcend styles from realistic to stylized, abstract to multimedia, but no matter the style, they tend to use color, lighting, and atmosphere to emphasize characters or storytelling elements. Let us look at some examples.
The colors used in backgrounds can tell us a lot about the mood of the scene.
The peaceful areas of Fern Gully are painted with these incredibly lush, cool greens and warm browns, telling the viewer that this area is safe, healthy, and living. But just a short distance over, notice how the same greens and browns near the human-infested areas sort of become yellowed and evoke a sense of blight and decay.
Colors like red and orange can invoke a sense of danger. Look at these backgrounds from Batman the Animated Series, or this one from Kid Cosmic.
Blue colors can invoke a sense of magic and mystery.
But desaturated blues, mixed with grays, can create harsh and unforgiving environments.
Look at this Star Wars matte painting. All of the cold steel here gives us a sense of the unrelenting authority of this location. And the cool thing about this background is that the black part right here was composited with the live action footage, making it look like the actors were really in this hangar. In this background from Final Space, we immediately notice this derelict spaceship. Because the hangar is almost all of the same color, it is clear that the most important thing here is the ship. And we also notice it because it is being hit by a ray of light. Also notice that half of the ship is being obscured by this completely black shadow, and this creates a sense of contrast that the audience cannot look away from.
The lighting and color choices in this painting make the viewer's eyes go like this. This type of painting creates an extremely obvious vignette and frames the storytelling element.
So, as you have probably noticed in real life, things that are far away tend to look quite faded. Dust and moisture in the air obscure objects at a distance, and we call this phenomenon atmospheric perspective. And it can actually be quite useful for focusing the viewer's attention. By adding more atmosphere, you can achieve a better separation between objects and focus the viewer's attention to what's important.
Here's a background from Pinky Malinky, where the only thing that matters here is the main character's house. Everything else is kind of faded out, and the trees are all almost silhouettes. And check out this background from Ghost in the Shell, where the enormous city back here is just bathed in light and fog that really pushes it away from this concrete ramp. The painters found a way to simplify what should be a very complex thing into just 2 zones.
Here is a scene from Tangled, and although this is a very detailed, ramshackled street, the atmosphere almost completely obscures everything past the third building into just silhouettes.
Everything we just said about light and color will absolutely be lost on anyone who has never painted digitally before. So now it is time for a basic painting tutorial.
To do this tutorial, you will need some line art, which we have provided in a link below, and a digital art program. Underneath our line art is where we will create our first color layer, usually called flats. And here's where we put down our first color shapes. You can do this by either painting or lassoing a selection and filling it. I like to block in the big shapes first and then change their colors so I can magic wand select them later.
I think traditionally we have this idea that digital painting is sort of a fun click fill process. But if you try that, it's not going to work because most background art is stylized with unfinished and imperfect areas. And handmade paintings are much more appealing than perfect ones.
The best way to change colors is by selecting an area and shifting these sliders. By pressing Ctrl U, this technique is called painting with sliders, and it is how most background artists paint. It is faster and allows you to see color changes in real time, as opposed to trying to choose a color, paint it in, only to then realize you could have chosen a better color.
Now that we have our basic colors filled in, we can add more details.
You can polygon select areas of this cube and Ctrl U some of these colors to make this side look darker. And I could paint this cone darker here to make it look like the cube is casting a shadow on it. Or you could add a new layer and paint shadows. So that way, if you don't like them, you could just turn them off.
Keeping your artwork separated into layers is a very good way of working non-destructively.
You can add a new layer on top of everything for highlights.
You can make a gradient by lassoing an area and then painting with a large brush that has soft edges. So now we can have these really cool light bloomy effects around all the edges.
A clipping mask is a good way to keep all of your extra layers cropped to your flat shapes. Alt-click on a new layer here, and now your messy paint stuff will be neatly cropped to the shape underneath. This works really well if your flats were done on separate layers and properly named. I'm looking at you, layer 73, copy 4.
So to recap, we have at the bottom our flat fills, followed by some additional details, some shadows, some highlights, and then our line art, and some glowy bloom stuff on top of that. And I'm sure you can imagine a more complex layer structure where a cone, cube, and cylinder are all painted on their own layers in groups so that you can move them around. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. If you guys didn't know, BAM animation actually stands for Brent and Max. But, I
think the B is for bald at this point.
and Max.
Bald and Max.
Last episode, Jedi sent us this angsty teen design, and we designed a background to match his character.
I would like for this scene to take place at golden hour, which is a time period of the day when the sun is setting, and as it recedes through the atmosphere, the light becomes very soft and flattering. Especially in LA, it blends with the pollen and pollution and turns everything pink and magical. It is a classic staple in cinema, and you can see it everywhere in movies like Top Gun, Die Hard, and Titanic. I'll start by polygon lassoing shapes underneath the line art, and then filling to quickly block in some flats.
Now, the first mistake one could make right here is that they could simply fill the road with black. But here's where we need to be more perceptive about colors. If we look at some of the examples of golden hour lighting, we can see that the road has taken on somewhat of a desaturated purple hue. So that is where we should be choosing colors from.
So why do the colors of the road change? It is because
lighting conditions affect perceived colors. So although we might think of a road as being gray, this is the local color, the lighting can change that, creating a new perceived color.
I want this painting to be mostly pink, purple, yellow, and blue, and I'm going to adjust all the buildings to fit that palette. The donut shop roof in real life is kind of a dull beige, but we can make it stand out by having it be the brightest, pinkest element in our painting.
Saturated colors draw our attention. By choosing one specific area to have the saturated colors in, you can create an area of focus. You could make everything super saturated, but then the painting would look very busy and probably be too distracting.
For example, I could have painted this car lime green, but that would be really distracting and compete with the area of focus. The last thing I'm going to try to do is make sure the shadows help frame the area of interest. Using a multiply layer, more on this later, I'm going to block in some shapes. I'm imagining the sun is setting over here, so that means all the shadows will go in this direction. And right here in the foreground, I will have a cast shadow from a large building off screen. This way we will get a really dark foreground element that will draw our eye to the lighter area here that contains our character.
You can play around with layer blending modes to create interesting effects. Top layers can interact with layers below them in a variety of ways. The simplest is opacity. You can reduce the opacity of a layer here to sort of wash out the layers underneath with the color of your choice. So maybe if you want to tint everything yellowy, this will be on normal blending mode. But if you change the blending mode to multiply, instead of blending colors together, it will blend and darken them. Screen will do the opposite and brighten the layers below it. And overlay will do a combination of multiply and screen. It will tend to add more contrast by brightening or darkening areas, depending on the gray value of the layer below it. And as you've seen, you can make some very interesting effects when applied with a gradient or a texture. Hard light is another interesting one. It sort of changes the layers under it to be closer to the hue of the blended layer. I use this when I need to change the color of something. And there are a million others, but you can just scroll through them by selecting the Move tool, holding Shift, and tapping plus or minus to scroll through the list, and pick whichever one suits your fancy.
To be honest, a lot of animation backgrounds are painted with default hard round brushes and flat fills, but some go one step further by playing with the size and softness of a brush, and painting inside a selection can make a gradient. Some backgrounds achieve a gradient by using a brush with a slight texture and playing with the opacity. Some create areas of texture using a special brush that sort of emulates a traditional dry brush. And some are made out of an arsenal of brushes, gradients, and texture overlays to achieve an almost traditional look. I can't really tell you what brushes made these, but what I can say is once you play around enough with brush settings and practice painting with them, reverse engineering these kinds of textures is not terribly difficult. I recommend trying out all the free Kyle T. Webster brushes that come with Photoshop, or purchasing some from a place like True Grit. Honestly, you can get brushes anywhere.
Now, onto our medieval village for Joey's character.
I want this to feel like a sort of misty, overcast day, so I will start off by choosing a lot of flat colors in the brown, yellow, and muted green tones. This background is fairly detailed and has an entire city back here, so my main goal will be to de-emphasize all of these buildings and mountains and try to make them seem far away.
Atmospheric perspective, as we already discussed, is the effect you get when faraway objects take on the colors of atmospheric haze. Notice how these mountains become bluer and grayer the further away they are. And just like how these mountains look in real life, you can separate your painting into zones of contrast.
I'm painting more mist on these buildings to push them even further back into space, and I'll lighten up these trees and the mountains to separate these areas even more. Now, it can be hard to know if the values you're choosing are working, but there is a trick.
If you have a black layer set to hue on the top of your painting, you can toggle it on and off to preview your artwork in grayscale. This will allow you to see if your painting has any value problems. So maybe that means that you don't have enough contrast between zones, or maybe there are areas that have too much contrast that are distracting from the focus.
The last thing I want to do is add some dry brush texture to this.
Tip: dry brushes. If you look at a lot of older animation art, they tended to use gouache, watercolor, acrylic, or cel vinyl, and there would be all these textured areas of highlights and sparkles. We can use certain digital brushes to emulate that look, to help make our digital art look more handmade or vintage.
I'm also going to use a few of Kyle's brushes and paint in some textures on a few edges. I can use the brush as an eraser, and I can erase parts of the shadows to give them a somewhat imperfect edge. And on top of that, I can add some grainy filters and some watercolor texture to kind of distress the entire painting.
There is a method of teaching color that uses the color wheel, and this diagram likes to show us that there are combinations of colors that harmonize well together, such as analogous, complementary, or triad. But we find that this is kind of graphic and overly academic. It presents the most saturated colors as being the most important, when actually each of these individual colors extend all the way to white and black. And it is here, in these blended areas, that we can find the most interesting harmony of tones.
And so for me, instead of choosing colors from a wheel, I prefer to look at movies, photography, and video games when trying to come up with interesting palettes. And I sometimes just straight up pick colors from these things when starting off just to lay down some of my flats. I feel like you can learn a lot more about color by doing film studies than you could ever learn from a wheel.
Brent, I mean, we're the ones that are going to teach people about color. I mean, look at our set. I mean, it's just pink and blue. The lighting's all over the place. You know what I'm saying?
Max, I've spent the last 2 years researching lighting YouTube channels. This is like my art. This is my cinematography. These lights are really expensive, and all you do is just sit here for 45 minutes while I set them up on you. Like, you just stand around and get lit and then read lines. And the colors are based on our logo, which you designed.
When he says get lit, He means get lit.
Onto our alien landscape for Arturo's character.
So backgrounds without line art tend to also be a pretty popular style. Unikitty, Pinky Malinky, Tangled, Samurai Jack all have this shape-driven lineless style.
To do this, I would turn down the opacity of my line art and then very precisely fill in each shape. These shapes have to be really clean since they will hold the forms of the painting. Then I can add more details with new layers on clipping masks. I tried to use very eccentric colors for the ground and vegetation while still keeping in mind the rules about color and composition, and I also tried to vary the hue a bit for all of these plants.
A common problem a lot of beginner artists face is they do not add enough color variation between objects. It's good to have a limited palette, but making all of your trees the same color can make your backgrounds look flat. So try varying up the hue between objects and find a harmonious balance.
The front of the painting I want to be really dark, so that way we sort of frame the composition up a bit. And the mountains back here will be even lighter, and I'll make these floating rocks really faded out. Remember that this stuff is being affected by the atmosphere, and since there is a lake in this scene, we can also add reflections.
Reflections mirror the world, but you don't have to make them super detailed. You can just sometimes use a shorthand and paint an indication of the colors that they are reflecting.
For these, I'll select an area and then paint with a gradient to make a reflection that slowly fades out. And for the final touch, I will add some light bloom. By choosing a soft brush, I can paint glows around the sun and moon and have light pouring in all around the ship. You can do this by selecting any color and then painting on a screen layer.
You know, ever since I shaved my head, I feel like I'm going into bowling pin mode. Like, I'm bald, I'm white, I'm pear-shaped, you know.
All right, we're going to be right back. I think a lot of people approach painting like a coloring book, and they have this idea that if only they had some line art to work with, they could probably do such an amazing job at coloring because it would mean that they wouldn't have to draw.
But as we've seen today, it's actually so much more involved. And in animation, coloring is usually a separate job because it is so difficult. The person who draws the background is often different than the person who paints them, because not everyone who can draw is necessarily good at color also.
And this is where I wanted to reveal that I am not actually the best at color. And for all the backgrounds you saw today, I consulted with biz dev artist Allison, who gave me notes and feedback on all of my paintings. And I wanted you guys to hear from her number one tips for background painting.
I think people focus on color too much when something doesn't look right. They think about things in terms of hue, and they'll do something crazy like turn the saturation up to 11 or something. And in reality, they're having a value problem. They try to fix it, but they're still unsatisfied with their art because they're turning the wrong knob, so to say. Most painting issues, especially for TV animation, can be addressed by simply looking at your art in grayscale and using value to focus your subject matter. The donut shop was just missing the foreground shadow to help frame the character. The medieval village had too many distracting background buildings, and we needed to push them farther away. And all of the foreground rocks here on the alien planet were all competing for our attention, so we needed to desaturate and darken them so they worked more as a framing device.
So, special thank you to Allison, who is one of our Discord moderators, for helping out. And if you would like to see more of her artwork, it is linked below, along with the BAM Discord. You know, Brent, painting backgrounds is fun, but you know what's really fun? Emailing your art to bam.redrawmyart@gmail.com.
Here at the BAM, non-union digital clones of Brent and Max painstakingly download all of your beautiful artwork. They sort, inventory, and delete the weird Sonic stuff.
Yeah, stop sending that. So the real Brent and Max can reach in and grab one at random.
Wow, Max, I love this one. I'm so glad that
insert name here
submitted their artwork. We should make an episode about
whatever topic will get clicks.
Wow, that is a good topic, Brent. I'm gonna hit that subscribe button right now.
Max, the clones are unionizing.